discretion is advised.
What was the most painful moment of your life? NSFW. Sneezing after corrective thoracic surgery with fluid in my lungs. Everything went dark for a second. After that I could suddenly suppress sneezes most of the time. Being diagnosed with cancer twice. For anyone wondering, I was diagnosed with stage 2A nodular sclerosis Hodgkin's lymphoma both times. I'm and have been in remission for about 5 months. For anyone fighting, keep fighting. My maximum pain was when being fitted with a metal halo for a brain MRI. The 4 screws on the halo had to actually contact my skull bones and poke slightly into them. The staff first injected liberal amounts of Novocaine into the 4 locations, then quickly tightened the screws. Even with the Novocaine, the pain of having screws inserted directly into skull bones was excruciating. It softened after about 15 seconds later as the drugs took effect, but that first 15 seconds is quite memorable. When I was in my early 20s, my best friend committed suicide. I couldn't even sit inside at her funeral because I was crying too hard and loudly. It's been 20 years, and I still think about her a lot and get triggered at random things that remind me of her. Had a catheter inserted into my calf to suck out blood clots. I had to be mostly coherent in case the doctor needed me to respond to him. My heart rate went from about 65 BPM to 140 BPM when he was inserting it. I never want to experience that kind of pain ever again. I fell over at a Turkish water park, knocking my 2 front teeth clean out of my mouth. For the next 20 millions they shoved a hose in my face to wash the constant bleeding. The teeth are probably still in the pool today. Infected tooth. Couldn't sleep, the pain was so intense. They were going to give me a root canal. However, they couldn't get it numb from the outside. The dentist proceeded to drill my infected throbbing tooth, while 2 assistants pinned my shoulders. Then injected Novocaine directly into the ducting root. It was the most intense pain followed by the most blissful release of endorphins. Once the numbness kicked it, I laughed with tears streaming from my eyes for a good 10 minutes once I was numb. Oh. And this happened on my birthday. Wisdom tooth rot, coupled with some kind of nerve pain. Plus for the removal, the doc said I needed antibiotics for 3-4 days to remove the infection before he could do the surgery. My experience with pain isn't a lot, but I've had dislocated shoulders, elbows, had a broken ankle, 3-4 times terrible gastro pain, and I dealt with them fine enough, no biggie. But persistent tooth nerve pain was, holy shit, like nothing I've ever experienced ever. As a 30-year-old dude, all I could do was just lie face down on my pillow and cry. I caught my wife in an affair and it totally broke me. But the worst part was when I found out that the affair was longer than our marriage and that none of the children were mine. Just kinda woke up one day and found out my entire adult life was a lie. She settled down with him in a nice little house they bought while she was still married to me. He dumped her because he couldn't deal with the kids. One, finding my husband in bed, doing the deed with my friend. He left me for her. 2, his death in a car crash 6 months later, leaving my 3 kids all under 8 years old without a father. 3, having to deal with her grief at the funeral. 4, being abandoned by his family while they supported her emotionally and financially while my kids had no help from them. Tore my ACL. Due to the adrenaline I didn't quite feel it. I felt something is wrong, but with the ice spray I felt like I can play. Went back in. First pass I got I felt a snap. Completely blew out my knee, meniscus and everything. I have cysts on my ovaries PCOS, and once when I was in high school, one of them ruptured on the bus ride home. Literally the worst pain I've ever felt in my life. I couldn't sit, but I also couldn't stand properly, and had to kneel in this weird crouching position on the bus until we finally reached my stop. I was in so much pain that I was throwing up when my dad drove me to the hospital, and once I got there I could barely function. I had to walk down a long hallway to the emergency room, sweating, in pain, and barely able to stand. I'm surprised I didn't pass out. One of the worst parts besides the pain, however, was the emergency room doctor that was completely convinced I was having a miscarriage, despite the lack of blood, and me insisting over and over again that I was a virgin. He kept shushing me and telling me it's alright. We're completely confidential here. When I insisted I had never had sex, it wasn't until he was off shift and an actually competent doctor came in hours later that I finally had an ultrasound done, and they informed me a cyst had ruptured, and all that pain was for less than a teaspoon of blood. Kudos to the kind nurse who brought me a blanket fresh out of the dryer though. Had an infected ingrown toenail. I know I should have had it checked out sooner, but here we are. Went in to have it removed. The injection to numb the area went straight in at the toe knuckle. They had to repeat it a couple times because infection counteracts anesthesia apparently. That hurt like a mofo. This is more of a mental hurt. When I was in college I lived in a suite. There were 6 of us all together, and we had a habit of doing surprise parties for everyone on their birthday. I was pumped because I never had one and always wanted one. My birthday is in June, which I understand is an issue, but I wouldn't have minded an early one. I asked my friend if they would be doing one for me, and I was told we didn't have time for mine. 2 days later they did one for someone else in the suite. I was so hurt that they didn't care about me at all. I regretted everything I had ever done for them. Went to commit suicide in the woods behind my high school. Lost my nerve at the last minute because I lied to my friend and said I was just going home. Eventually I just started screaming and crying. If anyone heard, they didn't say anything. Eventually I did just walk home and lock myself in my room. A couple years later, and I'm happy to say I'm doing much better. Edit. Thanks for the support everyone. It truly means a lot. I've talked about this before, but I didn't give my grandpa a good night hug one night. I continued playing on my computer. He had a stroke that night and died a few days later. I won't forgive myself. Had a doctor pull a toothpick out of my foot with no anesthetic. I was at my grandmother's house and got it in my foot. So my grandpa pulled most of it out with some pliers, but a piece got stuck, so after like 3 days my foot smiled up and I couldn't walk. So we went to see a doctor. His solution was to have my mother hold me down while he cut a wider opening with some scissors, then reached in with forceps and jersey the piece out. That's the first time I cursed in form of my mother and I didn't get in trouble. Probably sepsis in my leg from Vibrio vulnificus. Stepped on a sharp rock at the beach that got infected. That pain had me craving a bullet. That experience helped me understand why people get hooked on painkillers. The second they gave me Dilaudid I understood. Not physical pain, but no physical or emotional event has scarred me quite like this one. When I was about 12 I was snooping around my parents' closet. Squatting down to the floor, I noticed a little grey bean on the ground. It was opaque and squishy like a gel pill. I noticed it had a few spots on it. I couldn't for the life of me figure out what this was, and I tried for some moments to break it with my fingers to see what was inside. No luck. I was super curious, so I decided I'd bite off the top to squeeze the inside out. I put the top bit in between my canines and bit down. It popped violently, sending a spray of dark red into my mouth. It was a tick. The dots on the side were legs. It was full of something's blood. I gagged, recoiling in absolute horror, and ran to wash my mouth out. I can't describe the pit of fear and regret that formed in my stomach, but I can tell you it's still there. I literally want to vomit every time I think about it. Part of me thinks I'll eventually die of some weird parasite that's been living in my gut for decades. I used to work in a tick lab. My job was literally to go out and collect ticks from the forest and then extract any bacterial DNA to see what diseases they were carrying. I can't speak definitively, but I can't think of a single tick-borne disease where the incubation period is more than 30-ish days. So if it's been much longer than that, I wouldn't worry. Hopefully this brings some peace to you. That sounds terrible though. Edit. Since this is getting some traction, Please don't use alcohol or fire to get an attached tick off you. It takes a long time for the Lyme bacteria to get from the tick gut to its mouth when it's feeding. But if it's burned or doused, it will regurgitate in the bite and transmit the bacteria much faster. Always use manual methods like tweezers. I've even used 2 credit cards to get a tick off. Make sure the head comes off too. When I was swarmed and got my ass kicked by a group of 10 to 15 guys, I was 17, a little stoned and tipsy, walking home at night through my neighborhood. I grew up in a fairly rough hood. Group of dudes exiting a party. My dumbass doesn't cross the street. Next thing I know, I'm surrounded. They're pushing me around. And in an instant, I'm getting my ass kicked. I threw a few good punches, but ended up doing the turtle on the ground while they beat the shit out of me. I ended up in hospital for 36 hours. 2 busted ribs, 3 more bruised ribs, and for about 24 hours they thought I might lose one or both kidneys. This was the most painful simply because for some ducked up reason, throughout the entire beating I received, I was conscious the entire time, never got knocked out or passed out. And I still remember the feeling of the kick that broke my ribs. And that was about 26 years ago. When I was 12, I was woken in the middle of the night by the sound of my grandmother screaming. I was really confused as I was living in the UK at the time and my grandparents were only visiting from the States. She was wailing and making the most terrible sound. I could hear my dad downstairs on the phone to someone in America asking about the murder of someone with my grandfather's name. Again completely confused, because my grandfather was there in the UK. My parents kept closing my door and kept trying to keep it quiet until early the next day when my mum called me and my sister into her room and told us that someone had murdered her brother. He was a university professor and one of his students had shot him and his colleagues. It was the worst thing I've ever seen. You could see her just emotionally collapsing on herself as she said it. It was like watching a star burn out. And then we went downstairs and my grandparents were there. My grandmother was crying, which I could compute, but my grandfather was just sitting quietly. He'd just lost his only son and namesake and I don't think he could even process it. They had to fly to San Diego that day. I didn't see them for a year or so, and then a bit later we moved to America to help look after them. My grandfather never really recovered. He went to bed on the night of August 15th, 1996 and woke up a different person. His body died a few years later, but the man I had loved and hero worshipped slipped away that day. The absolute pain of that time is something I've never matched, the closest being my wife had a miscarriage. And the thing is not over 25 years later. It absolutely devastated my mother, who still struggles with grief issues. My cousin grew up without his dad. There are PTSD and anxiety issues all over the family. Now that I'm a father, I'm terrified of losing one of my boys like that. And it's one of those fears that's difficult to rationally dismiss because it's based on a thing that happened. Wouldn't wish the experience on my worst enemy. When my husband died, it's been almost a year and I still haven't found a way to keep going. I cry every day and wish for death every night. He was my only family. Every minute feels like hell without him. Waking up from 7 hours of surgery down in Guadalajara. They're real stingy with the pain meds down there. If someone had offered to kill me quickly, I would have agreed without hesitation. I have maximum out my nervous system as far as pain goes. One cannot experience more pain. The first time I had gout, I was traveling for work and swore I broke my toe on the last day of the trip. And then I had to take my shoes off and on for airport security. I had tears streaming down my face. Turned out to be gout, and the usual meds didn't work for me. So I had a week of just intense stabbing pain in my big toe and swelling to the point my foot looked like it would burst, before getting steroids to knock down the inflammation. Love of my life completely ghosted me out of the blue after a decades-long relationship. Then shows up at my work hanging all over some other person right in front of me. I asked what was up and got the response, "What are you talking about?" And then back to ignoring me like I was a complete stranger. I've been shot and blown up in a fireball, but this heartbreak is easily the worst thing that's ever happened to me by a really long stretch. I quit my job and moved out of the city just to avoid seeing that ever again. This was 2 years ago, and I still lose sleep from it and wake up from the nightmares. It was a painful moment that made decades worth of memories extremely painful and has made me question reality and life. Most recently was when I was sledding. Thought it would be fun to kick my friend's tube on the way down, but I don't physics goodly, so it was me who went off course. Went off the tube and hit a tree. Broke my arm in 2 places. Collarbone and a concussion. That hurt a lot. Was in a 4-wheeler's accident 6 months ago. These things are surprisingly unstable on rocky terrain. I lost control when driving through a small hole in the forest at a very low speed and fell in a 4 meters deep ravine. Flat on my belly, and the ducking bike followed me down and crashed on my back. Didn't pass out unfortunately. Waited 45 minutes for an ambulance with a collapsed lung. 7 broken ribs. A ducked up liver that had been stabbed by the ribs. My spine ducked up and a squashed kidney. It sucked. Be careful. These look like toys, but are killing machines. When I was 18. Ruptured patella 3 times in 10 years. Dry socket. But the worst was to learn I had undiagnosed ADHD combined type for 30 plus years. It hurt because so many injuries, misdiagnosis, and neglect occurred which could have been avoided. But luckily my meds and doctors have really turned my life around. Pro tip: if you are worried, seek out an expert's opinion. Then get a second opinion. Then trust your gut. No one can tell you what hurts physically or mentally, but they can help you find a resolution. Watching the love of my life dying in front of me. Nurse woke me up at 4 AM. Said he was taking his last breaths. I held his hands for 1 hour. We met when we were 18. Were together for 14 years. I died that day too. No one truly knows what I've been through those final days. Stupid COVID rules. Edit: just to clarify. He died of cancer. But because of the stupid COVID rules last year, he was not allowed to have any visitors. I had to beg the top management of the hospital to let me be with him in his final days. I didn't want him to die alone. It was just me and him in the room for that final hour. I think about it almost every day. Keep remembering it. It feels like he is dying again and again. Can't forget his eyes when he passed. If there was no COVID, we'd have been surrounded by close family and friends. Wow. I have such a wide selection. I guess these are the top 2. March 28th, 1981. I'm 16. It's an early spring Saturday afternoon. My dad goes upstairs for a quick afternoon nap. About 20 minutes later my mother starts screaming as she finds he died suddenly in his sleep. I looked in and saw my dad dead in his bed. That was almost 41 years ago and I still remember it clearly. May 7th, 1985. I'm 20 and a college junior. I had been dating a girl in college for a few months and I really loved her. I'm not the greatest looking man in the world, so I didn't have a lot of luck with women. Didn't help that I had no money or a car. After class on this date, we went to the student union building and she told me we need to talk. She told me she didn't love me and didn't know why. My heart was completely shattered. I was never the same emotionally after that. Every romantic dream I had ever had up to that point was destroyed. My world became a lot more dark and cynical. I have others. These 2 stand out. Waking up on the couch, late to give my wife some medication after her spinal surgery. Found her dead on our bed. Performed CPR on a corpse for what felt like forever until the paramedics arrived. It's replayed every day multiple times a day in my head. When I was 18, I slipped on ice and fell straight back on a bump in my driveway. The way I landed, the bump hit my right shoulder blade, essentially ejecting it from the socket. When I gathered myself, I was relieved I didn't crack my head open. But as I rose, my right arm felt like it was being weighed down. I looked down and saw that I couldn't see my wrist or hand, nor feel them. I ran inside to grab my mom and look in the mirror and saw my collarbone poking up from my skin, a hollow crater where my shoulder should be, and my arm was wrapped around my back in a grotesque angle. Turns out I tore every connecting ligament in my shoulder, the labrum, rotator cuff, etc. I was in shock for the first half hour, so I did not feel it. But when we got to the ER, there was an hour wait due to a drunken disorderly. I remember the panic I felt as the shock wore off, and I sat there crying. The true pain came after the surgery. They had to tack all the ligaments back into my bones. So when the pain blocker they give you after surgery wore off in the middle of the night, I woke up literally screaming for my mommy like a child. 6 months later, rehab started. 12 years later, it still hurts to sleep on my right side. My partner was going through some health issues, kidney failure, and as a part of his treatment he was put on a certain type of steroids at a high dose. We were warned about the nasty side effects of the drug, and so we weren't surprised when his mental cognition dropped. He lost all sense of taste and swelled until his skin was shiny and painful to the touch. He started losing his mind. I literally couldn't have a conversation with him anymore. He insisted on driving, but wasn't driving safely, so his parents and I called the cops to take his driver's license away. They also took his hunting rifles, which was a good idea in my opinion. My partner continued to get worse, deteriorating mentally. Then he refused to take any of his life-saving medications. He still has kidney failure. He was going to kill himself, and he couldn't understand why we were upset. It was about then we learned that the doctor who has prescribed the original dose of steroids had made a mistake. Instead of once daily, the medication said twice daily. My poor love had been overdosing for months, and we had no idea. Basically just thinking the whole time that the side effects were way worse than we were warned about. His parents and I made the awful decision to have him moved to a mental health facility against his will. He would call me screaming and crying until I had to ask the nurses to restrict his phone access. He hated it, and I think he hated us for doing it to him. This was the absolute worst time in my life. Not only was I completely helpless, but I had done this to him. I made that decision. He was there for about 2.5 weeks before he had detoxed enough his mind slowly started coming back. My story has a relatively happy ending. My partner has regained his mind completely, health-wise. His kidneys are still not in good shape, but we are undergoing different, more gentle treatment now. He has a lot of trauma from the whole thing we both do, but we are still together, and while it was the absolute most horrible thing I've ever had to do to someone, I maintain that I made the right choice. I think I saved his life, and even if he still resents me a little, I think I would make the same choice again. We never had to deal with the doctor that made the mistake again, but they are still practicing in our country and, to my knowledge, didn't receive any reprimand. Waking to blood-curdling screams and moans in the morning. Just sounds of agony and someone screaming, "Kill me. Let me die." I go to find my mother naked, fallen out of the shower. She'd hit her head on the shower stall or toilet and was bleeding. The room reeked of gin, almost as if you could light a match and it'd explode. She'd swallowed all of her pills and was foaming at the mouth, slurring words and eyes rolling back in her head. I was 10 years old. It was maybe 6 or 7 AM. School wasn't until about 8. I lifted her into bed and called an ambulance. She yelled at me angrily for it, begging me to kill her and let her die. I sat there while they lifted her onto a stretcher. They almost carried her out naked, and I yelled at them to put a sheet over her. I think they were pretty taken aback by the scene and a little nervous as well. I went to school and didn't say a word to anyone. My friends and teachers were gnawing at me to speak, and I didn't want to. They kept joking about how I always had a chip on my shoulder and asked why I was always so angry and grumpy. I broke down screaming at them about what had happened. Nobody said a word and everyone just hugged me. I didn't know what to do with that. Saw her later in the day. Tube down her throat. Black gruel vomit and spit surrounding it and flowing down her gown that she was now wearing. She wasn't responsive, but the doctors told me she was coming to. Also that if I hadn't called at the time I did, she'd be dead. Sometimes I wish I didn't make that call. Sometimes I'm thankful I did. She'll never know me for the rest of my life. But that's something she has to live with until she isn't alive anymore. That was the most painful moment. My breakup in college the second. Because I hadn't learned from my trauma how to find meaning, value, and love in myself. I instead placed it all on the relationship I was in and how I needed to make it work, even though my partner was neglectful and abusive. There's a lot of other extremely painful things to add to this list. Could be the tampon blood written words on walls, the pets killed and placed in the oven, my siblings beaten and raped by my father, watching my brother almost get strangled to death in front of my eyes, my sister almost killing herself, me shattering my inner elbow on concrete. In retrospect, I'm kind of shaped a lot by pain. I graduated college. I'm a project manager. I've traveled the world, but I'm still trying to find my stride and pay off debt. Also to live comfortably for once without having to feel like I'm just trying to tread water and stay alive. I'd like to enjoy life and explore it while also working and not be saddled by debt. So I hope more of this pain goes away. I feel it's all been pain leading up to now. When does the other part get to begin? Edit. I did not expect to receive so much attention from this. I've been in quite a rough patch lately. Because my mother did drugs. When I was a baby I was born premature and with lung as well as heart issues. I was on a nebulizer most of my life as a child. Fast forward to now. That saw me hospitalized by COVID, even though I'm vaccinated. Kind of felt like another docu from my past trying to kill me. Also homeless at the moment, living out of my truck because a living situation I was in turned out to have a horrible landlord. I have jobs, but they don't pay enough or give enough hours. And now that I'm recovered from COVID, I hope to find better paying opportunities. Been feeling sad, alone, and like I can't really talk to anyone or share what I've been going through. Especially because it is usually too much for my friends or people in my life to care to hear or listen to. Also, therapists only understand so much, and getting totally in sync with one is as rare as a good relationship. So I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for your words of care, compassion, empathy, and support. I really needed them in this moment. I'm actually on the beach in my truck and it's 5 AM at the moment. Time to make my coffee and prepare for the day. Seriously, thank you to everyone. It truly does mean a lot to me. Even though I don't know, and likely won't know many of you, I do feel less alone and that people care. So that's a lot for me. Thank you. Click subscribe if you enjoyed this video.